It's now the fall of 2023, and it's been approximately 7 years since the events that started this channel, that started this project. And I wake up with a lot of hurt, a lot of sadness. And for much of this time, the hurt and the sadness has been big enough that I've felt afraid of feeling it. I've never learned how to grieve well in this culture. And there's a lot of layers of humiliation and shame that have been placed on top of my trauma and grief in the first wave of abuse in childhood, and in the second wave of wounding of abuse at the Human Awareness Institute. And so in the fear of that amount of sadness, and the fear of that amount of grief, loneliness, and pain, I've become 40% addictive, meaning just to look straight at that grief, straight at that pain, has been insufferable, meaning I've been unable and unwilling to feel the real pit of that for most of this time. And one of the things that makes this morning a little bit different is I'm able to look with sadness, with grief, with pain, and a feeling of aloneness at that grief, at that pain. And to understand and put into words, which is part of looking at something, is to put it into words. What that is, without going into reaction. And so I have known of this pain and grief since it began to unfold, and yet no one was there to hold it. No one was there to contain it, meaning that the adult in me and the self in me was not presenced enough to be able to hold that level of grief, that level of pain, and the adult in others was not there, was not present to hold that level of grief and pain. And so it becomes uncontained. And uncontained, intense energy is generally destructive. A nuclear reaction that is uncontained is highly destructive. It can be highly constructive, when used to generate power for a city, but it takes a tremendous amount of skill, a tremendous amount of container to turn that massive release of energy into something that is beautiful, that is regulated, that is attuned. Right? So the birth of this energy happened in a very unregulated, a very unattuned environment, and thus became highly destructive in my own life and in the life of those around us. And that is that's enormously sad. because I would say that the essence of what this pattern represents for me is that what is most beautiful, what is most true, what is most good, what is most life-affirming and evolutionary was cut down, was sacrificed, was thrown under the bus by all concerned in order to protect, in order to enable what was smallest, what was most ignorant, what was most fear-based, and what was, I guess, the most devolutionary. Right? And so, what plant medicine can do is push the culture aside for a matter of hours, to put the cult, right, and all of its armoring aside for a couple of hours and reveal what is true, what is possible, what is good, what is beautiful. And then the question is, can the identity, can the pattern that the ego attaches itself to, can the identity of the group, of the individual, of the culture, can they hold and move towards that, or do they kill it off in order to protect the status quo? And in the case of all concerned, there was no reaching forward to welcome the new life into the space. Right? I made my very best attempt to do that for about 6 months before the fear in me, the ignorance in me, the trauma in me said, I can't do this alone. And that voice, that energy, that sense of self and evolution was not welcomed into the Human Awareness Institute, right? It was cut down at every level. That cutting down began with Peter Sandhill denying, creating a shadow as he arrived with secrets with his wife, etc. And then it continued with pushing down truth as I talked about the hurt that he had caused originally, right, in using a therapeutic session to pursue his lust rather than to open and unpack his client, his student. And, so from the moment any of this started to open, Peter pushed down anything about himself, right? But that was actually the core wound. The core wound around the Human Awareness Institute began with Peter Sandhill, right? And so you cannot heal and understand a core wound when your therapist is trying to block it and deny it. And so that was the beginning in the middle of the session, right? But then the betrayal of the container of all that energy, right? Not showing up on time for the session, not communicating, right? Continuing to lie and stonewall, right, about what's going on. And then ultimately with other of my therapists, Ann Watts, first of all, meeting to exclude the client, to exclude that part, right? When everyone has a meeting to defend the status quo and exclude the part that is seeking to bring light into the situation, it's very clear that, human awareness is what's evolutionary about the Human Awareness Institute. But if the meeting is designed to exclude the only one that's bringing that awareness and is organized to create a cabal of secrecy, of silence, then again, that part is rejected. So every person has a part that speaks of truth, that speaks of beauty, that speaks of goodness. And every person has a part that shuts that down, that is afraid of where that might lead in our ultimate fear of the unknown. When we are instilled with ignorance, when we are instilled with faulty beliefs, when we are instilled with fear, we fear ourself. And when we fear ourself, we fear the unknown. We fear the world. Right? And so as these voices in the world and in us resonate and come up and speak of change and speak of visibility and speak of being seen, right? They are met with suspicion, they are met with fear, they are met with uncertainty, they are met with an awareness of losing control. Because whenever we change, whenever we open to something new, we change. Whenever we let in a new awareness, we change. Whenever we change, we expose ourselves to the unknown, because the world changes with us. And whenever we and the world changes, there's a letting go. There's a sense of, there's an awareness that we are not as much in control. The world is too complex. It's too intricate. It's too big to be able to control and predict all of the variables of change. And so there's a fundamental sense of trust or distrust in self and, by extension, in life and the unknown. And when we lack that fundamental sense of trust in self, and we fear others in a projection of that going out, we seek to stop change. We seek to avoid the unknown. Now, that fear in me was strong going into the session. Right? I've never done anything like this before. I don't want to take such a high dose. I don't know what place it will take me and whether I'll be all alone or whether I'll get support. Right? And in that role, Peter was the pusher, was the don't worry about anything, I'm going to be here. I will die if necessary to take a stand for you. Right? Open up to the experience. Right? So the voice of the opener, which is in each of us, right? There's a voice that feels the pain, that feels the ignorance, that feels the frustration, that feels the sadness, feels the depression of the status quo that so much is pushing us down. And there is the voice of the hopeful one that says, no, give it another try. open up, right? Open up again. There's been cuts and there's been disappointments, but open up again. Become more aware, right? But there's so many painful things that I don't want to be aware of, but there's another voice that says to open. Right? So in that role, right, the request for help came from me, right? The fear came from me, right? The request for help came from me. The fear came from my father. Right? As a young child, bringing light, bringing openness to my parents, they did not want to feel and see certain things that light brought about. Right? And so that fear, through violence, through shame, through humiliation, shut down that sense of opening. Right? I understood that my parents wanted me to be small, wanted me to be alone, because that was much more comfortable to them than being open, being awake, being present. Right? And so I became very small for them to make them comfortable, to make them happy. Right? I received the shame, I received the humiliation, I took that path. Right? And that small part doesn't want to get in trouble with the parental figure, doesn't want to upset the parent, the therapist, the leader. Right? Because truth always upsets. It takes the set and takes it up, right? Truth always upsets, right? Move something up. It changes things. It shakes the status quo in an upward direction. Right? But the controller that says, I can't predict everything that's going to happen here. I can't keep you safe. I can't keep you safe if we change, if we move this energy. I can't do it. Right? And so the choice is made at some level. It's often an uneasy, shame-based choice, but the choice is to kill off the story. Right? The White House makes the call to the news agency and says, if you run this story, you're not going to get any interviews at the White House. On the other hand, if you kill this story, we'll give you an exclusive, right? You will get a look at all these photographs that nobody's ever seen and get to have a nice in the Oval Office, right? Well, we'll be able, like, what do you want to do, right? Do you want to actually run the story and upset the system? Or do you want to have an exclusive, right? Because otherwise we're going to give that exclusive to your competitor. Just saying, right? Don't run the story. Don't tell, right? Mom and dad say, don't let anyone know. Here, have a lollipop. Don't tell anyone, right? Okay, all right. The boss comes in and says, who's with me on this and this? Like, you're going to get a raise. You all, the people that don't, you're going to get fired, right? And we got to work together, or all of us lose our jobs, right? We can't just tell the truth to the police, to this, that. We got to all work together. I hope you know what I mean, right? So this is the voice of protection of the status quo. Now, I've lived in fear my entire life, right? I've lived and made the majority of my decisions have been done anchored to fear of shame, fear of rejection, fear of being hated, for existing, fear of not being understood, fear of being feared, fear of being ugly and unlovable. Right? I want to do this and this, but people might be anxious and nervous and believe I'm a bad person, so I'm not going to do that, right? And I'd like to make this money or whatever, but people might judge me and hate me for making this money. Or I'd like to do this and people may hate me for that. And so out of fear of that shame, out of fear of that hate, out of fear of upsetting other people, I go inward, I stay small, right? But of course, there's a depression in there. There's an exhaustion of spending so much energy trying not to upset other people. And there's a grief at giving up so much life in order to make the system, make the status quo comfortable. And in the psychedelic journey, right? In the psychedelic experience, that falls away a little bit. And a blessing, right? To be connected with self, to feel that aliveness, that love, that opening, to be able to speak truth again. Right? Of course, it immediately made the power figure uncomfortable because I was talking about Peter Sandhill, how he had hurt me, right? How his fear and greed and stuff were not the way forward in this situation, right? Peter was very attached to making his money. And yet, that attachment is not the optimal environment to awaken someone to their self, right? The attachment to not seeing things and to having money and to secrets, right, is not the best environment, right? So if you are going to be more attached to money, more attached to not seeing things, more attached to secrets, and more attached to diverting your client, it's not appropriate to make money. Right? It costs, if you succeed in diverting someone on their path to self, it's priceless, right? You could pay them $1 million and it's not worth it, right? But of course, Peter Sandhill didn't want to pay me $1 million for the wound or the diversion. He wanted to be paid in money and then be paid in praise, and well as being paid in secrets, right? So he wanted it all, right? He wanted the delusions, he wanted the money, he wanted the lies, he wanted the secrets, and he wanted to push my sense of self away, right? Rather than go into any of his change or smallness, right? He wanted to be a great healer, a great lover in the space while sacrificing his wife, his organization, his clients. And he wanted to be paid for it. So, well, who doesn't want that, right? Who doesn't want to stay in their comfort zone but grow, right? To be incredibly cruel but be looked at as a great hero, right? Who doesn't want to stay the same but get all of the benefits of changing, right? To have it all. And I don't have to feel out of control. I don't have to look at my shadow. I don't have to I don't have to tell the truth. I don't have to learn the skills to do all this stuff, right? If people will just agree to tell me how great I am, then I don't have to learn the skills of being a great therapist or this or that, the other. I can just be told how great I am and learn and practice very little, right? And so that's, of course, who doesn't want that in our illusion, right? Because we're focused on the outer world, not on the inner world in our culture. So if everyone will pay a lot of money and agree to say these words, and we're focused on the outer world, well, then it appears like it's incredibly successful. If you look on the inside and what is the impact on one's own psyche and on other people of creating all of those lies and deception, the outer money, the outer praise means nothing. We've actually been diverted from our true growth, from our true reach. Right? And out of desperation, right? I was desperate to be loved by two parents with complex PTSD who could not do the mechanisms. Right? They couldn't do the mechanisms of love. They could feel secret love and turn away from it. They could feel secret love and stay silent. At least my father could. But when it came to express that love, it was more gruff, it was more violent, it was more painful, right? And so I felt afraid much more than I felt loved. And I understood that my role was to become invisible, to produce comfort for parents that were uncomfortable seeing and being seen. Right? And so that creates a deep loneliness, a deep fear. Why are we becoming invisible? What's so wrong with who we are? And so in the dynamic of opening for a second time in my life to who I am, and realizing how upset that made Peter Sandhill, and how upset that made my therapists, and how frightened that made the board of directors and facilitators at the Human Awareness Institute. Right? My job was to become smaller. This time I knew it was wrong, right? And so I could go through the motions. But as a traumatized child, psychologically, right, I could not, in the face of so many children, in their fears, in their regression, I could not find the sustainable place to connect with myself. Right? But I did understand that what was happening was not of awareness, was not good, that what was good in me was being thrown under the bus to protect what was evil, just meaning devolutionary, in me, in the Human Awareness Institute, and in the Human Awareness Institute community, right? Because you cannot get leadership that succeeds, that goes ahead of the community, right? There was no competent response in the community to the awareness of incompetent and destructive leadership in high. And that's the way it is, right? When we vote for incompetent leadership at a presidential level, at a guru level, at a therapeutic level, right? When we vote for incompetent leadership, we get incompetent leadership. Right? And so, there's a tremendous, in this drama, right, in this enactment of the psyche, there's a tremendous hurt, betrayal, rage, right, that all of my leaders, right, all of my therapists, all of my teachers betrayed what was best about what was best about themselves, and what was best in me, in order to construct new defenses to protect the shadow from visibility, from transparency, from awareness, both within and without, right? And so the control protocol that cut me out, not entirely, because the bargain is always there to be made, right? If I would just apologize for the audacity of challenging the system and agree to silence and agree to skew my view to the darkness, to the ignorance, to the absurd, to the insane, then I'm welcome with open arms, right? Because that's part of how ignorance perpetuates, right? Let's make a deal. If you will not whistleblow about this and that, we'll give you a golden parachute, right? Special treatment. And everyone lives happily in death, in ignorance, in confusion, in insanity, in schizophrenia, right? And that's, that was always offered to me by my parents. And of course, it was extended to me by the Human Awareness Institute, right? But once one has lived a lifetime in fear, once one has taken that bargain for a lifetime, once one is so depressed, so lonely, right? So dark from those lies that they want to commit suicide rather than live in that darkness. Then to taste the light and realize that there is so much worth living for. There is so much beauty inside, and could be so much beauty out there. Well, it's not worth it, right? Because the lies lead to suicide. The insanity leads to suicide. The betrayal leads to suicide, because it is death. It is devolution. To kill off what is healthy in your child in order to protect the paranoia of one's cult is death. It's death at a cult level. It's death at a family level. It's death at the child's level, right? And so the child may present the symptoms of suicide, but they are not the only ones that are killing life, that are killing themselves off. They are, in many ways, the truth teller, right? Because there again, the cult butchers, the cult commits genocide on large portions of the psyche and pretends that nothing's going on, right? It cuts off the exuberance. It cuts off the sensuality. It cuts off the truth. It cuts off the empathy, right? And leaves a cardboard box in its place. And that is suicide, right? The heart exists in that cardboard box and withers. That is suicide at a large scale. And when too much vitality within the cult is truncated and cut off year after year, the cult slowly dies. It fails to have a sustainable rapport with its ecology. When more and more of its energy is spent burying the secrets, and less of its energy is spent growing, The cult moves towards the death of 95% of all cultures that have existed in human history. 9,500 cults and counting are dead. Their languages are dead. Their voices are extinct. They don't exist in the 500 cults and cultures we have today with their own language. Many of them are dying off, right? So it's, right? The truth teller, the sensitive one, the black sheep, may be the one to commit suicide, often indirectly so as to protect the feelings of the parent, right, by addiction rather than a gun. Right? But those that want to make a statement of how far the cult is asking them to averge will do it more directly, will be the lighthouse to say this cult is going towards death. And a change must be made in relationship to the self, in relationship to awareness. A change must be made, or this cult will become part of the majority of cults that die out rather than grow into something more beautiful, more true, more useful in life's cycle of evolution. Right? So when suicide is no longer, right, appealing because there's an awareness of the self, when secrecy, depression, and death are no longer appealing, right? Because we've taken that path for 40 years. And it's not resulted in anything worth living for. The question is what to do, right? And I chose the path of visibility, of transparency, of awareness, the path of truth, the path of data, the path of revealing the wound, which is in our cult to be ostracized, to be silenced, to be excluded. And so as I pick that path, there is a new wounding of exclusion, of silence, of hate, of fear. Right? And it is incredibly poisonous to something new in a vulnerable state, to have all that projection of fear and hate directed at it. It is the poison that we have directed as a species towards 99% of minorities that we have killed off. Homosexuality, diversions from the cult, right? And different ways of doing things, truth-telling, whistleblowers, like we are constantly pruning and killing the things that create anomaly, that create divergence from the status quo. And it has been a very painful journey, right? Because I could not stay connected with that self after only 10 hours of exposure to it, really only 3.5 hours of that psychedelic journey connected me with myself, right? And the rest was spent in confusions of various forms, resulting in. So to meet self and try to orient towards that in the midst of all that fear and aloneness, right, was very, very painful. And so in the midst of trying to protect myself from that overwhelming pain, that overwhelming grief, that overwhelming loss, right? The self, right? The self weeps, the self cries. But my layers of shame were too thick. Humiliating grief as weakness, humiliating feelings as vulnerability to torment by my father. That I could not weep, I could not grieve. I could just become frozen and numb, which is what happened, right? The re-icing of the self. And with it, the most horrific pain, right, of losing what is good, what is beautiful, and the descent into the reptilian brain, the traumatic brain, of fight, flight, and freeze with fear. And while the truth was not met at the Human Awareness Institute and lobbied for, the fear, the anger, the hurt, and the hostility and manipulation that emerged was met, was respected, was responded to. Meaning the Human Awareness Institute began to be a little bit more intelligent, a little bit more sane, and a little bit more helpful as I descended into my reptilian brain. Right? The transcendent brain was excluded, was banished. The truth was excluded and banished. I was cut off of email lists in case I told the community what was happening. Right? But they were happy to make a manipulative deal. If you won't do this, or if you will do this, or I'll do this so that you don't do that. Right? Out of fear, out of ignorance, in order to cover things up. Right? They were willing to sue. They were willing to sue to shut down my voice. And this is the loneliness. The authentic self is not welcome. The adaptive personality, the reptilian brain, is not only welcome, it is paid well. Right? And so this is this is the human wound. Right? When you understand that out of sheer empathy, people will not cross this line. But if you stick them up with a gun, they'll give you more than the line, right? You say, please, can I have some money to feed my children? Get out of here, you bum, right? You stick a gun to their head, and suddenly, don't hurt me. I happily give you everything that you want. Just don't hurt me, right? So when you're dealing with reptiles, it's always out of fear. Fear motivates more than what's good, what's beautiful, what's true. And that is a lesson that I learned again, right? First from my parents, then from my therapists. And I learned that again from my culture, my community. And that is the deepest pain that remains, because it isn't personal, right? It isn't personal. Much of our culture is in a reptilian state, meaning the pivot point as we consider going into the beautiful unknown is not is it good, is it true, is it right? The pivot point is it unknown? Am I frightened of it? And when the answer is so often yes, and what is good is kept out because it's unfamiliar, not of the family, right? There's a depression. There's a killing off of young plants when they need water, right? And so that depression we carry as a culture, that suicide we carry as a culture, those lies we carry as a culture, that schizophrenia, the compulsive addiction we carry as a culture to avoid this tragic wound because we don't know how to respond to it. Right? This is a myth. It is a myth that we live, right? The story of the self in relationship with high is a myth. It's a story that reveals core elements of a pattern that we all participate in to varying degrees. And as is customary with the myths that are most deeply brought up and held as tightly as identity, as identity, as patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, that the ego says, that's me, that's mine, that's who I am, that's the way the world is. The ego clings to that story, right? The ego on the outside, the ego on the inside clings to that story. Right? And the identity, the pattern repeats itself, generation after generation, person after person. The pattern repeats itself. We kill off a little bit of life. We go deeper into depression, deeper into lies, deeper into schizophrenia, deeper into insanity, deeper into turning away, to not looking. The shadow grows. Life becomes a little bit more painful, a little bit more lonely. The suicide rate ticks up a little bit more. The fear rate ticks up a little bit more. And we fail to respond. We fail to show up as adults capable of loving that grief, capable of loving the innocent one, the child that will do anything and everything for the giants they depend on, including becoming the smallest, ugliest ball that will hold all of the shadow of the family and being evicted. What do you do when the response to desperate innocence of, please love me, I will do anything? What do you do when the answer is, okay, I want you to take all of my hurt and my pain that I pretend I don't have, and I want you to express it. And then I want you to be beaten. I want to shame and hurt you for carrying what I hate about myself. And then I want to send you as far away from here as possible and pretend that it's all your fault. And then I'll be happy. You'll be happy, Dad? You'll be happy, Mom, if I do that for you? Yes, that's what we'd like. Right? What do you do when that is the answer? Right? And then we execute the children that express that in the extreme. And what do you do when that is the way that we receive and honor life in our cult?